Welcome to the 67th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Will Lavender, author of the thriller novels Dominance and Obedience. Well, welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Will Lavender, author of the new thriller novel Dominance, available in bookstores now. In describing Dominance, the best-selling writer Jeffrey Deaver wrote, "Dominance soars to the top of the thriller genre by infusing its rapid-fire plot with the mysteries of literature and authorship." Will, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Sure. Well, I wondered if, at the beginning, if you could just read the first couple of paragraphs of your new novel, Dominance.
Absolutely. Just after dark, they rolled in the television where the murderer would appear. It was placed at the front of the lecture hall, slightly off-center so the students in back could see. Two men wearing maintenance uniforms checked the satellite feed and the microphones, then disappeared as silently as they had come. It was now 5 minutes before the class was to begin, and everything was ready. This was the first class of its kind, and its novelty, or perhaps its mystery, made it the most talked about ever offered at tiny Jasper College. As mandated by the school president, there were 9 students in the classroom. They were the best of the best in the undergrad literature program at Jasper. Now, on the first night of the semester, they waited anxiously for their professor to emerge on the screen.
Great. Well, if the listeners haven't heard of Dominance before, can you describe your new novel?
It's kind of a cross between The Silence of the Lambs and Agatha Christie's, and then There Were None. It begins in this kind of strange classroom, and the professor is actually teaching from his prison cell via satellite, and so the students are watching him on this television screen. And what he's teaching them about is this reclusive author named Paul Fallows, and he's trying to give these 9 students clues so that they can find Paul Fallows. He tells them that he's come upon some new information in prison. So he starts giving them these clues, and the students take notes the way diligent students usually do, but then they find inside the notes that their professor is trying to literally lead them to Fallows himself. The novel jumps back and forth in time, and it moves into the present day, and it follows these students, particularly one of them, Alex Shipley, who becomes a professor at Harvard. And in the present day, the students begin being murdered one by one, and so the students have to meet up back at their old college, Jasper College in Vermont, and sort of figure out who is, committing these crimes. So it uses this kind of locked room mystery. The students all return to Jasper, grown up, older, and they all sort of live in this big house when they're at Jasper. And as the murders begin to happen, the reader begins to believe that it's probably someone inside the house, one of the students themselves who's committing the murder. So I was really trying to riff on this kind of like locked room puzzle mystery idea that Agatha Christie made so popular.
Sure. Well, I'm curious. I know that some writers don't like the question about, how did you get your ideas, but I'm curious if you do remember how the original kind of premise for Dominance came to you. And also there's a game that's a part of the novel called Procedure, and I wonder if you remember how you kind of came up with the idea for that game.
Yeah, usually what I'll do when I'm sort of trying to come up with a novel, I usually drive around a lot, or I watch a lot of late night television because there's a lot of debauchery and craziness on late night television, so you can get some really good ideas. I was watching television late one night, and I saw a story on one of these forensics shows, like Forensics Files or whatever it's called, and it was about a college professor who had been accused and convicted of murder. And they interviewed this guy 10 years later, and he had seemingly been rehabilitated. He was talking to the reporters. He said, I I still believe I'm innocent, but I have turned a new leaf. I'm not the same person I was. I am teaching classes at college, and one day I would love to teach actual classes via satellite from prison. And I thought, what a weird idea that is, to have, possibly a convicted murderer, on television teaching a class. So that's kind of how I began. Usually ideas will come to me in very small snippets, and I'll take that and sort of build this, world around it. I don't know if that's normal for writers or abnormal or what. That's usually how I go about it. The procedure itself, I was driving around listening to the radio, and I heard about a game that college students were playing called Zombies versus Humans, which is basically like a glorified game of tag, where some students will sort of make themselves up like zombies. Other students will play zombie hunters, and they chase each other across the campus. And I thought that's odd. But what if that game were really serious? What if it were not like a joke to students, but something that had these elaborate rules in it and hierarchies, and people took it extremely seriously? What would it turn into? And so that's the procedure, which is an incredibly detailed and mysterious game.
That's great. Well, Dominance is a thriller that celebrates books and literature and reading. As you were working on Dominance, were there other books or authors that particularly inspired you?
That's a tough question. There are writers that I go back to a lot. For Dominance, I realized that when I got about 100 pages into it that I was using some ideas from Silence and Lambs. And if a reader gets into this, they will realize that that's the main sort of inspiration right away. I mean, you've got this heroine who has to call on a mentor. The mentor figure is a little bit twisted, and he begins to lead her into solving the crime. So, I mean, that's right out of, Clarice Starling, Hannibal Lecter right there. And I realized that if I were going to do something like that, if I were going to write sort of an homage, then I needed to read Silence of the Lambs, because I never read it. I'd seen the movie, obviously, as most people had, but I had never read the novel, so I stopped. And I read the book, and it blew me away. I think it's one of the few thrillers that can stand up as true literature. I mean, it's definitely one of the best I've ever read. And I realized as I was reading it something else, that what I was doing was a little bit different than Silence of the Lambs. I mean, he used the same kind of framework, but it had other ideas. And I thought I could use this, sort of riff on it, but make it something completely different. So definitely Silence of the Lambs was a book I went back to and used. Hopefully readers will not believe that I ripped it off, because I don't think that I was necessarily doing that, but I was definitely sending it up and paying tribute to it in some ways.
Right. Well, you mentioned earlier this idea of kind of the locked room mystery, which is this classical kind of Agatha Christie and others as well mystery plot. But obviously, you're updating that classic form and making it very contemporary. What is it about that kind of classical form that appeals to you?
Well, there are a couple of things about it. One of the main things is that, and it's the reason that in both my novels I've used college campuses, because I do not like writing with an outline. I like surprising myself as I write. I mean, that's one of the reasons I write these kinds of books, to see how far I can go, how far I can push the boundaries of the genre and all that. But what setting a novel on a campus does is it puts all the players into one small spot. You can't have the killer come in from the wings and say, "Oh, it's John did it," who I introduced back on page 5. If you're on a campus setting, you know that you're in this sort of like closed-in environment, and I've liked that, and that's why I've gone back to it with both my novels and with my third novel I'm working on now. I like the sort of small-town environment that it creates. So a locked room mystery obviously does that, and it does that, even more intensely, because all of the players are not only in one small geographic area. All the players in the locked room mystery are literally put in one place. And then when you do something like that, I think it allows you to sort of bring the reader in and make the reader an active part of figuring out who did it. In a lot of mysteries, the reader is active, but the reader is sort of using the clues that, the writer sort of doles out at the writer's own leisure. In a locked room mystery, some things will happen that I think the reader can pick up on that the writer did not even intend. It becomes, I think, much more cerebral, much more active, and I love that idea of the reader sitting there playing along, almost like turning the novel into sort of a board game a little bit. If you do that, you obviously run a risk of alienating the reader. And I think that my books are really not meant for everybody, maybe for that reason, that the reader can feel manipulated a little bit. The reader can feel like there's a little bit of a coldness going on. But I've always enjoyed that sort of interplay between writer and reader. Even when I was writing poetry, when I was getting my MFA, that's the reason I wrote poetry. I wanted the reader to kind of get in there and work with me to figure out what was going on, how to sort of interpret the poetry. I see these thrillers as sort of the same way, that I want the reader in there with me, trying to beat me to the punch, trying to figure out who the killer is before I reveal it.
Right. That's interesting that you mentioned poetry, and obviously you have an MFA. I'm curious about your journey. I mean, how do you go from an MFA and writing poetry to writing, best-selling thriller locked room puzzle books? What was your journey to publication? With your first book, Obedience.
Well, the way I've come to this is basically through reading. I try to write, what I would love to read. And when I got my MFA, and I went to a place called Bard College, which is known as sort of an experimental school. And for a long time, for about 5 years in my 20s, I wrote only experimental stuff. And then I slowly moved into genre. And one of the reasons I moved into the genre, into writing mysteries, is because I started to read a lot of them. And I began to think as I read them, this is really clever. I mean, some of them are not clever, and some of them are not that great. But there are a lot of very good writers in this genre, I think, and a lot of writers who seem to me to be doing some experimental things. I mean, they weren't writing experimental literature, but they were experimenting with the conceits of mystery fiction. One of the first thrillers that I read when I got my MFA was called Closers by Michael Connelly. I mean, it's not one of Connelly's best books, but I read that, and it blew me away because of how plot-oriented it was, how he used the clues, how he sort of brought the reader through the paces of the book, how he used the readers to sort of, to play a little game with, essentially. And I thought, how fascinating is this? And I started to read those kinds of books, and I thought, I can do this. I can write this. I think all writers should probably write what burns them up, what sets them on fire, what they would really love to see on the shelf. And, as experimental fiction sort of got, I would put that in the rear view, I began reading these new things, and they started to burn me up. And I thought, I want to do this. I want to write and do the kinds of things that these writers are doing. So essentially, what I do is just sort of a tribute to all the great writers that I love.
And so what was it like for you going from experimental fiction to writing Obedience? Did you find that you had to do several drafts? Did it come naturally to you? And then what was it like? I assume that you found an agent and went from there. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, and writing Obedience I wrote Obedience in 2 months. And it took me 2 years to write Dominant, so it was completely a different kind of thing. After I wrote Obedience, I quit my job. My wife quit her job. I thought, we're going to live, fat and happy, and it's going to be great. And I'm just going to write these books every 2 months, and I'm going to have 50 of them, and I'm just going to sell you. You have these delusions of grandeur. And, of course, it didn't turn out like that because the second book was so grueling to even conceive, and then the structure of it is so unusual. But when I started Obedience, I had written a lot of poetry, and really I became a college professor for a couple of years, and I had written very little of anything. And when I came to fiction, especially, thriller fiction, it came really easily to me because it was almost like I had been wanting to tell this kind of story for a long time. and it just sort of, just came out. I can't really explain the ease of that book, and I wish they were all like that.
And what was that experience like? I mean, you said you wrote it in 2 months. I mean, that's, for some people listening, that may seem, just amazing that it obviously came pouring out of you.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me looking back because, I've Dominance, like I said, took 2 years. I'm working on the third one right now. That's taken, about a year. And, so it's an unusual thing. And I really, like I said, can't explain how it necessarily happened. I think it was just, and it's, it's a novel that has a very straightforward structure. I think that's one thing. It's not a tricky book in terms of how it moves. So I didn't have to conceive of flashbacks and how I was going to make characters consistent from different time periods. It's a pretty linear book. So that helped a lot. But yeah, I wish I could really put my finger on why and how that happened, and I could bottle it and repeat it again and again. But I really can't. But getting the agent you asked about, Laney Becker is my agent, and I just, it was kind of an old-fashioned thing. I got on the internet, found about 20 agents that took electronic queries, and I queried and got my agent. However long it took, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I think, when I wrote Obedience, I knew that I had something not good, because it's really, really difficult for a writer to call what he or she writes good. But I knew I had something unusual, and that's always been, what I'm going toward. I love cop books. I love police procedurals. I love private detective novels, but I'm never going to write one, because I don't know anything about that world. I would have to do more research than would be worth, the toil of writing it. But I do, I can use some of those conceits in there and turn it into something that's my own, and it's sort of unique enough for me. And so that's what I thought I had when I wrote Obedience. I thought, this is a unique thing. I don't know if it's good, but I know it's different. And I think that helped it. It helped me get an agent and helped it sell relatively fast.
Great. Well, given your experience thus far with your poetry writing, and then, as we've discussed, moving into more commercial fiction with Obedience and Dominance, what tips or advice would you offer for aspiring writers who may be wanting to write and publish their own novels?
Well, I've been asked this quite a few times, and I don't have anything different than what a lot of writers would say. But two things that I always respond to when people ask me this question is first, I think you need to have a thick skin and be willing to work past rejection, because rejection is just part of the business, as they say. I got a really bad rejection on my first novel, and it came at a kind of odd time, because the agent had held it up a little bit, and she sent me the rejection letter about the time the book was going to publishing houses in New York, and it was a really, really scathing rejection. And I've received a few of those, and I think a lot of writers have, and it would be easy to just kind of pack it all up and say, well, if this person doesn't think I've got it, then I don't. But that's not the way to success. I think the writer has to really have a thick skin and has to believe in what they're doing, because writing is so solitary. A lot of times we're not showing our stuff. Most times we're not showing our stuff to anybody. We're the only person that is inside the work. And if we don't love what we do, nobody's going to. So you have to believe in yourself. It's easier said than done, but I think writers, specialists, have to believe. And the second thing is, I think you need to read a lot. Read inside your genre, outside your genre. Read things that you would never, think that you would enjoy. Read constantly. And learn what other writers are doing. I think influence is a major part of becoming a good writer, and using that influence and not shying away from it. I'm still to this day reading writers that I think, man, that's really interesting how she did that, how she moved one chapter to the next or whatever. And I think writers need to need to be willing to pick up those tricks and use them.
Great. Well, you mentioned earlier you're working on your third novel. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, it's called the Descartes Circle, and it's a little bit of a deviation from my first two books, but it's not a radical shift or anything like that. It's told in the first person, and it's about identical twins, one good and one evil, and a crime has occurred in one of the twins' lives, and the reader has to figure out which twin did it. And of course, the Descartes Circle. Descartes comes from René Descartes, the philosophy of Descartes. I'm no expert on Descartes by any means, but I was interested in using some of his ideas in the book, and it's been really interesting to sort of do a little research on him. But I really got the idea from reading this book over the summer, early in the summer, called The Psychopath Test. It had a real impact on me. John Ronson is the author of that, and it's about evil and sort of what constitutes evil. How do you define it? How do you notice it in the world? And so the book is about that in some ways, and I think it's just a fascinating field of study. Again, I'm no expert on it, but I have read quite a bit on it writing this book, and have sort of been able to see how some writers define evil and what it is and what it's not. And so that the book is kind of hinges on that main question: what is evil, and does it exist?
Well, your readers will have something to look forward to with your third novel.
I hope so.
Where can people find you online?
I am at willlavender.com. My last name is Lavender. I'm on Twitter at Will Lavender, and I've got my Facebook fan page, Will Lavender, of course. So I'm online, definitely easy to find. I love talking to fans and meeting them, both online and in the real world. So I'm out there, pretty easy to find.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Will Lavender, author of the new novel Dominance, available in bookstores now. Will, thanks for doing the interview.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to my latest podcast. If you have a chance, please leave a review of the podcast in iTunes. It only takes a moment. Until next time, read some good books and be well.
You spend the first hour of your vacation at the luggage carousel thinking there's nowhere to go but up. But there is a place to go but up, because when you open your suitcase, you find it filled with dolls. Dolls like the ones in that movie that scared you so much you wet your girlfriend's bed. Ah, Marissa, the one that got away. You return the bag to the airport with relief. It lasts until you get back to your room, where a fallen doll waits to greet you.
Don't let a suitcase full of dolls ruin your vacation. Go on a real vacation. Go RVing.
Hear that? Is that America cheering or a sausage patty sizzling to perfection? It's time to cheer for Egg McMuffin and fresh cracked eggs at McDonald's. It's time to wake up to the aroma of freshly baked biscuits and treat yourself to a real honest-to-goodness morning meal. Breakfast, it's on at McDonald's. Now enjoy a large iced coffee for just $2. Add a breakfast sandwich to make a meal. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer or combo meal.